most people in Lebanon, and it seems in Israel as well, assumed that Hezbollah had been defeated. So the level of weapons that they have, the way in which they're prepared, tactically, militarily, they're doing a job which I don't think anybody would have expected. And this is what we're seeing today. And I think the Israeli response, which is what they always do, is to say, okay, we take something, and since we can't really understand what's going on immediately, we're just going to destroy everything in our zone. We're going to threaten by saying we're going to put 450,000 soldiers and reservists and whatever at the border, and we're going to invade Lebanon up to the Litani River, if not even north of that, and we're going to destroy everybody. We're going to depopulate the entire country, and basically, literally say that they're going to create sort of Gaza-type conditions in chunks of South Lebanon. But in reality, that's not going to stop Hezbollah now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. While much of the world's focus has been on the US-Israeli war against Iran, there's another front that's receiving far less attention: Lebanon. Israel is once again escalating its war here, threatening to carry out the Gaza model, destroying civilian infrastructure, causing mass displacement, and signaling territorial ambitions that mean land theft, ethnic cleansing, and occupation. So what is Israel trying to achieve in Lebanon? How is Hezbollah responding? And what does this front mean for the wider regional war, especially as Iran remains at the center of it? Joining me to discuss this and more is Karim Makdisi, co-host of the Makdisi Street podcast and associate professor of international politics at the American University of Beirut. Karim, welcome to Dispatches on Breakthrough News. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we've got some not so pleasant things to talk about, but you are the person to talk to them about. Both of us are speaking from Beirut, where we're now week 4 into this Israeli escalation. This is going to come out a couple days after we've recorded, but as of now, just to throw out some numbers, there's been 1,079 deaths in Lebanon, killed by the Israelis, at least 118 children. There's an attempted invasion taking place in the south. They're attacking civilian infrastructure, including bridges and medical facilities. 128 of them have been attacked. At least 40 medical personnel, though I'm sure that number is a little bit higher now, have been killed by the Israelis, many of them in double tap strikes. I mean, I can go on and on about the horrific destruction they're meting out against this country right now. But I think a good place to start would be maybe the basics for our audience. As you know, Hezbollah sort of entered this broader regional war with Iran after months of Israeli attacks and ceasefire violations, over 15,000 of them. So I'm curious, Karim, from your perspective, explain your perspective of why Hezbollah entered, why now, how much of it is tied to the broader war with Iran, how much of it is tied to sort of the domestic problems in Lebanon.
Yeah, no, I think you laid this out very well in terms of introducing how things are in Lebanon. I think basically this discussion about why Hezbollah started, or I wouldn't say started the war, I would say escalated, because there was a war. And I think the proper term is more that they escalated when they did. And there's, I think, a couple of big reasons. I think the proximate cause, and just in their own words even, was, yes, it was after Khamenei was assassinated in Iran. But really also in terms of militarily and tactically, they wanted to take the initiative because it was fairly clear that the Israeli government had taken a decision to themselves launch, what they call a preemptive attack on Lebanon, on Hezbollah, basically. So they decided for military and tactical reasons to initiate this before the Israelis were fully prepared to do so. And that's the kind of proximate cause, I think, as to why Hezbollah entered when it did. But I think we can discuss it, but there's, of course, a much deeper issue here, which is that in the end, the way I see it is that you have a resistance project and you have sort of an Israeli Zionist project, an expansionist settler colony that's there. And these two projects simply can't coexist in the long term. They are, at least as they have been for these past decades, mutually exclusive projects. So this business of there being this much larger war that we're seeing today is something which I think a lot of people were thinking would happen, and maybe thought had happened last year in 2024, and had finished. And clearly it hadn't. Hezbollah had been preparing themselves for this war, and perhaps this is the so-called final war.
I mean, it would seem like it. It seems like an existential war for many actors, including Iran, and we can get to to that in a bit. But I think also it's interesting to see all these sort of like think tankers and analysts chime in, especially from DC, because maybe I was guilty of this too in a way. I think there was a perception after 2024 that Hezbollah had been severely degraded, and I mean, you look at what happened, right? The Israelis killed the entire senior leadership, and the organization came out of that 2024 war seemingly defeated. It was a loss. It was a loss in many ways. All that said, I think watching now what's taking place, we're seeing Hezbollah behave and respond to the Israelis in a way that definitely challenges that perception of them as having basically been defeated. So I guess from your perspective, do you look at what's happening and do you see, Hezbollah's having been rebuilt, and, how do you think their capacity now, as we're watching this war play out, how does that compare to what we saw in 2024?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair to say that most people in Lebanon, and it seems that in Israel as well, assumed that Hezbollah had been defeated in the big sense of being able to pose any kind of threat to the Israelis themselves, as opposed to a kind of internal force where still they had influence within the country itself, but not as an external threat to the Israelis, and certainly not in any kind of that they had no deterrence vis-a-vis any kind of Israeli attacks. I think that it's fair to say that most of us and most people kind of assumed that. It's clear that what happened since that November 2024, not even a ceasefire, cessation of hostilities agreement that took place, we saw that on the Israeli side there were 15,000 recorded violations by the UN and by the Lebanese government. It's clear, and on our side, or Lebanon side, there was literally 0 violations across the border from Hezbollah or the Lebanese side towards the Israeli side. There were 0 violations as opposed to over 15,000 violations. In the meantime, the idea of the main, let's say, responsibility of the Lebanese government was to, and Hezbollah, was to say, okay, we're going to disarm and remove at least the heavy weapons and most of the weapons south of the Litani River, and at least move it to the north. And then north of the Litani River, there would be a second phase where that would be negotiated, and there'd be some kind of discussion. The reality is that for the most part, the Lebanese army, which did deploy to the border areas and to most of South Lebanon, and did take control over a lot of the key kind of points that Hezbollah had their bases on, there was disarming. In other words, the vast majority of Hezbollah's weapons were removed from South Lebanon. That seems to be clear. The army had certified that the vast bulk of them had been removed, except in areas that Israelis retained control. Because remember, Israel was supposed to have withdrawn as part of this agreement. They were supposed to have withdrawn from all of the occupied lands, and they didn't. They retained several points that they said they were going to keep, obviously strategic locations that they were going to keep. They did not allow, I think there's around 60,000 or at least 60,000 civilians from returning to their villages, which is what they were supposed to have done according to this agreement. So they were clearing out. They were not going to allow in a 2, 3, 4 kilometer zone along the border. The Israelis were not allowing people back. They were not withdrawing their forces from the key points that they had taken. And so what Hezbollah was doing in this period, which was around 15 months or so, was on the one hand, according to what they own say, they were giving the Lebanese government a chance to negotiate the withdrawal of the Israelis and a kind of more permanent agreement. On the other hand, in reality, they understood that would not happen. So they were preparing themselves for this war that has now come. And it's very clear that they have prepared in a way that has taken everybody by surprise. The level of professionalism, the level of weapons that they have, the way in which they're prepared, tactically, militarily, they're doing a job which I don't think anybody would have expected. And this is what we're seeing today. And I think the Israeli response, which is what they always do, is to say, okay, we take something, and since we can't really understand what's going on immediately, we're just going to destroy everything in our zone. We're going to threaten by saying we're going to put 450,000 soldiers and reservists and whatever at the border, and we're going to invade Lebanon up to the Litani River, if not even north of that, and we're going to destroy everybody. We're going to depopulate the entire country, and basically, literally say that they're going to create sort of Gaza-type conditions in chunks of South Lebanon. But in reality, that's not going to stop Hezbollah now, and this is connected to the larger regional war that Iran has, that includes Iran.
Right. I mean, that was a really good distillation of all of the of Hezbollah now, and I think we can't talk about that without maybe going a little bit into at least the fact that this is happening in a very divided country, right? Lebanon is so polarized. I think maybe it always has
Absolutely.
been,
Yeah.
But very much so now, especially in wartime. We have this government here that's talking about negotiating with the Israelis without any preconditions while they're under fire, right? Not even demanding Israel at least hold their fire first, talking about, we're willing to recognize Israel. We're willing to maybe normalize relations. Like, just really, it's almost embarrassing to watch. While also saying, the state has a monopoly on arms, which makes sense in a normal situation, but there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense right now here. Talking about the need to disarm Hezbollah in the middle of a war while the country is under attack. How do you make sense of this internal dynamic contradiction, especially with just yesterday, it's so insane. I mean, I was looking at the Lebanese foreign minister, who I think might be Lebanese forces, but I'm not sure. You can correct me if I'm wrong on it. He is. Okay. I was looking at his Twitter feed. I've been watching it, waiting for him to say something about the fact that Israel's attacking the country. He hasn't said anything about Israel. He even condemned the killing of that priest in the south by the Israelis without even mentioning that Israel did it. And then every other tweet is about Iran, condemning, and not explicitly, but almost condemning Hezbollah, talking about the need for a state monopoly. I mean, it's just, how do you explain this contradiction? It's happening in the same country. On one side, this fierce resistance force, fighting to the death to protect their homes and land against an invasion. And on the other hand, these people in suits, begging Israel to be their friend.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I hope we have about 6 hours to go through this. It's Lebanon, especially in this kind of contemporary period of the past, at least 20 years, if not more. It's kind of a schizophrenic country. There are at least two different projects, and I if I want to be fair, I think there's three. I think there's, and we can go back, we can go into the history of it if you want in a little bit. But in essence, you have one group which now is represented, especially, let's say, by the prime minister and his cabinet, in which they basically say that Lebanon, it can only be secure and eventually work towards a certain form of sovereignty, such as it is, if they do not enter any war vis-a-vis the Israelis. So if you provoke the Israelis, if you attack the Israelis, if you're in any way anything but entirely neutral in their sense of neutral, then the Israelis are going to come in. You're going to give them an excuse. You're going to give them a legitimate excuse. The foreign minister that you mentioned actually earlier had said the Israelis actually had a right to attack in Lebanon, which was really
Crazy.
Quite something. So that if you give them this excuse, they will come in, they will destroy Lebanon, they will destroy the infrastructure. And it says in service of not of a Lebanese interest or a Lebanese project, but of an Iranian project. So in other words, Lebanon will sacrifice itself again in this logic for an Iranian project as a kind of forward base for Iran in order to be like a negotiating card for Iran kind of down the line. That's how one project sees it. And within that project, I would say you can split it into two. Not everybody that's part of that believes that or has that inclination is necessarily, for example, like the Lebanese forces or some of these other more kind of right-wing or neocon kind type forces that genuinely would be happy to kind of create conditions of turmoil and instability in Lebanon in order to rid itself of kind of internal enemies. But you have those that are tired, that are simply want this thing to end, have taken the discourse of defeat and to its end and say, listen, we don't have a choice. There is nothing. Hezbollah, the resistance, even if we support it, even if in principle it was okay, was defeated in last year and Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. The pager attacks, the kind of the level of destruction that the Israelis did in Lebanon is with full American support, is something that we simply cannot deal with. So we simply have to enter negotiations, come up with a deal. Look what's happened in Syria. The Syrians are doing this. we can talk about Syria, but Syrians are doing this. And why should we be any different than Syria? Why should we be different than Egypt? Why should we be different than all of these kinds of countries? We are the last country that will be signing a deal, and here we are. So that's the logic. So some of it is insidious. Some of it is just like we have no choice, and so we are defeated, and we have to act basically like a defeated country in order to save what's left of our state and what's left of our sovereignty. And in order to rebuild and reconstruct, you need to have some kind of deal and some kind of terms with the Israelis. And when they say the Israelis, they mean Americans, because for them, it's not so much, you're dealing with Israelis insofar as you're dealing with the Americans, and the Americans tell you have to do a deal with the Israelis. But really, the guarantees that these guys look for are it's always America. It's not really the Israelis. They look for guarantees from America. And then the question that we can talk about is America a good guarantor? So that's sort of one project. The other one is this resistance project, which of course is led by Hezbollah on the ground militarily and politically, but also has, there are other smaller groups and certainly kind of leftists and others who kind of would, anti-colonials, anti-imperial types, who would subscribe to this as well. And for them, they see the Israelis as an existential threat. It's not simply a question of, okay, all right, look, the times have changed. We have to do a deal at some point, sooner or later. Let's just get as good a deal as we can and try to preserve Lebanon's territory, its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and get as good a deal as possible, basically. That won't work, because no matter what you negotiate with the Israelis, they will take more. They will hold, always. They'll take, and then they'll push more. Right? We see this in Palestine. We saw this on the Oslo Accords in Palestine. We've seen it in the Gaza negotiations. We've seen it now with the Iranians when the Israelis and Americans kind of say they're negotiating and then they kill the negotiating team. We've seen this over and over and over. And there's no reason to think or to assume that any deal that we come up with here, as happened in 2024, in the November 2024 deal, which was concluded and with American guarantees, in the end, America allowed these 15,000 violations. Even though there's a mechanism that's supposed to monitor this, that's US-led mechanism, they basically did nothing to censor, to say anything, to even condemn all these violations that happened. They really did nothing. So what is the point of having another agreement with an expansionist Israel, where they're openly declaring that they want to turn South Lebanon into a kind of Gaza-type situation, or even settle it, or occupy it, or whatever, and poses this larger existential threat that if you do not create some form of deterrence, at the least a deterrence, then negotiating with them is simply giving up all Lebanese sovereignty and a chunk of Lebanese territory. And these are just very, very different. And I'll stop here, but I think it's important to maybe get into the discussion, which is to say, when you take this split, which has been around at least since the 2006 war and the kind of lead up to the 2006 war, if you take this split, then we're talking within Lebanon a fundamental, I'm not as an academic here, but it has very real impact, which is to say the very notion of what is a state, what is sovereignty, what is resistance, and what is the function of a Lebanese army, among other things. What does security mean? What is the basics of security? What is the basics of a state? What are the functions of a state? This is not just a kind of, there's a deep and utter kind of conflict as to the very meaning. That's before you get to policies and plans and strategies. There is a deep, complete and utter mismatch in terms of expectations and conceptual understandings, let alone the practice of it.
Yeah, just hearing you say all that, I'm just thinking to myself, the people who are of the segment who are like, we're done with resistance, it doesn't work, like, not that they ever really supported it, we just want to make a deal so we can be a normal country and like move on. They're always talking about sovereignty and how we don't want external influence in Lebanon. But meanwhile, these people are actually quite influenced by the Americans and the Gulf monarchies. And they act like they're not. Like the same people who are like, yeah, let's kick out the Iranians, Hezbollah is just basically the IRGC, it's Iran meddling in Lebanon. But you all are totally dependent on foreign actors as well. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with Lebanon is like, it is a playground for so many different countries. And so all these people who talk about sovereignty and, the national bloc and all these things, it's like, again, why is it okay that you're trying to attach yourself to the Americans or the Saudis? But, I want to ask you about the Lebanese army before we move on, because, the Lebanese army remains largely on the sidelines of this war. And I think a lot of people are watching from abroad and thinking, like, why is it that this army doesn't fight Israel, right? Like, and Israel's even killed several army soldiers. I think the number might be around 5 at this point in this war alone. So I'm wondering if you can explain, why is it that the National Army of Lebanon is not confronting Israel directly? Like, what are the constraints there, whether they're internal or external, in shaping that?
Yeah, again, it's a kind of complex question, because talking about the army is literally talking about this dispute that I'm talking about in terms of what is the state. I mean, the army representing the state. The idea of what is the army supposed to do. So the easy answer, in a sense, is to say the Lebanese army, like any army in the world, should be defending its borders from outside attacks as a kind of primary, obvious thing. For others, clearly that's not its main idea. The main mandate for the army from the other side is to say, no, the Lebanese army's main role is to disarm all non-state militias, meaning in this case Hezbollah, for the most part Hezbollah, some Palestinian factions, but really Hezbollah at its core. And that's the main function that it needs to be doing in terms of security. In other words, your sovereignty, Lebanese sovereignty and security, will be only established when the Lebanese army deploys across the country and disarms any non-official, non-army force operating on the ground. And as I said, that means Hezbollah. So there's a completely separate understanding of what the main role of the army should be in Lebanon. Now, in practical terms, the Lebanese army, there's two very important points to say, I think, here. One is that I think it's fair to say that politically speaking, symbolically speaking, in terms of legitimacy, I think the army probably is, and it's often said, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's true, that the Lebanese army is pretty much the only public institution in which the vast majority of Lebanese agree and, let's say, have favorable opinions towards. You look at the army and you say, okay, this is an army that is there to protect the country, and is not there to create problems or to create conditions of conflict or war. It's, there's kind of positive feelings towards the army, not everywhere, but sort of on the whole. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the reason that there is a kind of consensus about this feeling about the army is precisely because they've not put themselves over the past couple of decades, they've not put themselves in a position where they've had to oppose one group over the other. So this is important. So what the Lebanese government has now been asking of the Lebanese army, and this is why there's a lot of pressure today, is that the Lebanese government took a decision, I can't remember, a couple of weeks ago or so, as soon as Hezbollah escalated in the south. The Lebanese government took a decision to first declare the Hezbollah military and security wings as illegal, basically, and at the same time basically requested that the army, or demanded that the army go in and disarm Hezbollah now in the middle of this war and arrest anybody, Hezbollah members, but whoever they find illegally carrying weapons and going across places. And they've arrested, I think there's 20 or 30 or 40 people that they've arrested, and they're currently on trial or being investigated. So this is going on. But what the army has done, and the general of the army, Haikal, what he's come and said is that we are not in a position, and it is not our job in this case, to go in this moment and go in and forcibly put ourselves in a position where we are disarming and going after people by force in the middle of this war. That's not what the army function is, because they understand very well that if the army were to do that, then the army would very likely split up, and an army that splits up will create really bad internal conditions. So this is the kind of thing. And bear in mind that the army has no real weapons. The army is largely kind of funded by the United States. It's run, with the British as well, and there are other forces that basically help to run the Lebanese army, provided with even its uniforms, its guns, the fact that it doesn't have serious weapons to defend itself. It doesn't have any kind of even defensive weapons to defend itself, even at a very basic symbolic level. It has nothing, and that's through decisions that the United States and its allies basically do not let the army do so, because the army is meant to be an internal force to disarm so-called militias, as opposed to an army that's there to defend the country from external threats. So the army doesn't even have these weapons to do anything. So what the army has done now is it had to redeploy from the positions it took over the past year and a half along the border and in the south, and they've removed themselves and put themselves in their major barracks in Marja'iyun, in Tyre, in Saidan, places, kind of the bigger areas, and remove themselves from basically from where the main battles are taking place now between Hezbollah and the Israelis along the border zone. So it's a really interesting question, because what happens to the army is of fundamental importance, not just now. Again, militarily, they don't have very much they can contribute, but in terms of what might happen post-war, if there is a post-war, what happens to the army in that case will determine whether or not, or will go largely to determine whether we're going to end up in a kind of civil war type situation after this war ends, and that's extremely dangerous.
Well, okay, so I want to shift gears a moment and talk a bit about Israel's objectives. Israeli officials are openly talking about pushing their border, whatever their border is, to the Litani River and creating a so-called buffer zone. You have Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. I'm sure you saw he explicitly said that we should annex the south of Lebanon up to the Litani and make it Israel. You have the Israeli defense minister. I think he's the highest level official now to say something like this, Israel Katz, explicitly saying yesterday, the day after or the day before we recorded this, that the Litani River should be Israel's new border. We should occupy southern Lebanon. This is also happening in tandem with this massive forced displacement of the numbers are something like over 1 million. 25% of Lebanon's population has been subjected to forced displacement. And of course, these are almost entirely Lebanese Shias from either the south or from the southern suburbs of Beirut. But all that's to say, Israel Katz is also saying those people, he specifically named, by the way, the Shias. He was very sectarian about it. He didn't say Lebanese. He said the Shias who have been displaced from the south cannot return until I say so, until Israelis feel safe. And we know that means never. When it comes to the Israelis, when they kick Arabs out of their land, they mean never can they return. All that's to say, how seriously should we take this? There are people who are like, no, this is just a fringe element inside Israel. But, the defense minister and the finance minister aren't so fringe.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think there's two main points that I would say here. The first is that so aside from the basic objective, we want to destroy Hezbollah, eliminate them, etc. That's kind of the other part, which they've always tried to do, which is to create sectarian tension and potentially divisions within Lebanon, like sectarian identity-wise. They want to create problems in Lebanon so that no matter what happens on the ground militarily, they can create conditions in which Lebanon itself is split, it's divided, and there's a lot of sectarian tension. And their main goal in this case is to create sectarian tension and agitation against the Shia. So as you're saying, because of what the Israelis have been doing, and especially over this last period, there's I think it's over 1 million displaced officially, but probably even more so, across, especially in the south, but the suburbs of Beirut, etc. These are going into areas, and by the way, whenever they kind of create these, they send these little tweets where they send the zones that are going to be attacked at any given moment, and then they put directions where people are supposed to go. And the directions that they send, the sort of safe zones where they're supposed to go, is often done on purpose to go through, kind of Christian or other areas, in order to increase that sectarian tension. That's at least what they try to increase this sectarian tension. So this has been a goal that they've tried forever, and it's never really worked. And yes, there are incidents here and there where there is tension going on, and even yesterday we saw there was a fight going on in Juni. But the issue is that in general, if you imagine that 25% of the population or so, with the war and with the sectarian kind of connotations that goes with it, kind of goes into most of Lebanon, you would imagine there should be a lot more fighting, a lot more tension. There should be fights every day. Can you imagine if 25% of the American population, especially certain kinds of American population, I don't know, what's the American part? It's 350 million, 400 million people. Imagine if 60, 70, 80 million people were to pick up and go somewhere. Especially in certain classes and certain different demographics, if they were to pick up, you could imagine, or Europe or any of these places. So the vast majority of people that have gone to these different areas have been treated with respect. They're not. they're terrible conditions. It's humiliating. It's terrible. There's no stability. There's uncertainty. It's all this kind of stuff. That's 100% true. But in terms of the conditions that the Israelis are trying to create, they've so far failing at that. And that's where you get some forces, and I think these right-wing forces that we're talking about, their role internally is to try to push harder this Israeli objective, which is to create more and more sectarian tension. Because as they understand that Hezbollah militarily is not as destroyed as they thought it was, or as weak as they thought it was, then they have to work on the sectarian agitation part in order to undermine Hezbollah during the war and after the war, when they want to, depending on what kind of deal happens. So I think this is a kind of important point for the audiences to kind of to bear in mind. So that's one kind of major point. I don't know. You said you wanted to ask another thing.
Well, I guess with the territorial expansion aspect of it, and I mean, you've already alluded to this, as this has always been a long-standing ambition of Israel.
Yes.
Whether they could actually carry it out. Yeah.
Right. So that's the point. I mean, I think what people should remember is the Israelis don't have declared borders. The Israelis don't have a constitution. They have a series of basic laws that kind of enshrine apartheid inside Palestine, but they don't have declared borders. And so this business of, when we talk about expansion and the Greater Israel Project, you're talking about a country that does not have declared borders. And so with that in mind, we can go back. I mean, I think, at this point, it's fairly clear. We go back even to 1919, or over 100 years ago, when the Zionist delegation after World War I, when the Middle East was being repartitioned, following European kind of deceptions and their promises to the Arabs, and they started to divide up Palestine and Lebanon and these different countries. The Zionist delegation had gone to the British and told the British, please, when you're negotiating Palestine-Lebanon borders with the French, please put the border to the Litani River, because we know eventually we're going to need South Lebanon for the water resource. There's a lot of water resources for economic reasons. It's a very fertile lands, and we're going to need this for our future state when it comes to pass. Now, they didn't do it because the French screwed the British because they wanted to protect the Maronites, and so they kept the border where it is today, because they wanted, they basically wanted the area to protect the Maronites and the Christians within Lebanon itself. But over the decades and over the years, the Israelis time and time again, under Labour Party and Likud Party, have kind of said, we want South Lebanon. Ben-Gurion made it clear in the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s. With the Israeli invasion of 1982, it was clear that they were going to keep. So it transforms from we need it for agricultural, economic, water reasons. Then it becomes we need it for security zone. Then it becomes we need it for for Greater Israel, for ideological, for settlement. So there are different reasons, but for 100 years it's been consistent that they view South Lebanon as part of their project, whether it's actual total occupation and obliteration of everybody in it, or control in terms of total demilitarization, where they effectively control what happens south of the Litani. It comes to the same. And with a country that does not declare its borders, that's even, we need to take that seriously. It's not like a country that's just talking, you say, okay, whatever, it's just saying something. It's a country that has invaded Lebanon multiple times. It's a country that has threatened Lebanon multiple times. It's a country that is literally, as you mentioned, saying that they want to turn South Lebanon into Rafah and into, various parts of Gaza. And we should take that seriously. This is not a joke. It's something to be taken very, very seriously. So
with regard to
territorial integrity, it should be fundamental to all sides in this.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer-supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us.
Well, with regard to, you mentioned Ben-Gurion and the French getting in the way. I mean, the earliest iteration of the idea of the Litani being their natural border was Ben Gurion saying it in 1919. And isn't it the irony?
Ben Gurion comes later, but Ben Gurion comes later. But the first Zionist delegation.
The Paris Peace Conference, I guess, David Ben Gurion and other Zionist leaders,
yes, and others, exactly,
included the Litani.
Exactly.
But what I think the ultimate irony there is that the French wanting to create a Maronite state and screw the British is what made that not possible,
absolutely.
At least for that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But,
absolutely.
all that's to say, we're also looking right now at this really widespread destruction. You mentioned the idea of wanting to create little Gazas across southern Lebanon. And we're seeing this widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, all this displacement. I think one way to look at this would be like to call it a kind of Nakba. Like this to me looks like ethnic cleansing. It's depopulating people from the south. You actually have, just to take it a step further from just from what we're hearing about annexation and occupation, you also have settler groups starting back in 2024, Israeli Jewish settler groups, who are renaming villages in South Lebanon in preparation for eventually settling it, and are actually amongst each other purchasing and selling land for Lebanon. I mean, I think we should take that very seriously. Like they want to do what they've done in the West Bank to South Lebanon, to parts of Syria. You had freaking Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel, tell Tucker Carlson Israel should be able to have the whole Middle East. Like we should take that very, very seriously. Israel's also, though, and you and I have experienced this because we're in Beirut, striking.
By the way, Randy, it's also Tom Barak, the American envoy here, was also talking about, hey, the Sykes-Picot deal that created all these different countries. Maybe the Israelis and others don't believe that this should be this case anymore, and so maybe there should be a greater Syria again. Expanding parts of Syria into Lebanon, north of Lebanon. Maybe the Israelis, can what are borders after all? These are artificial, so maybe the time to kind of rethink that. So what does Tom Barak, the American envoy, represent? I don't know, but the reality is in the discourse they're preparing for a kind of a changing of the borders, and as you're saying, we need to take that seriously.
I want to ask you, because this has been such an ongoing ambition of the Israelis, and on top of that, this is not the first time they've done these kinds of things in Lebanon, right? This is the 7th invasion of Lebanon since 1978. So kind of like zooming out a little bit, I want to ask you, how do you think this moment, this 2026 invasion by the Israelis, attempted territorial expansion, how would you compare it to past attempts? How would you compare it, for example, to the invasion of 1978, 1982, 2006? Like, how is it similar and how is it fundamentally different? I think that those things kind of matter to sort of understand what's at stake today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And again, there's a lot of nuance and kind of complexity that goes into that. The one thing I think that ties all of this together is, as I was just saying, there is a need or a desire, not a need, a desire for the Israelis to take South Lebanon in one form or the other. In order to take South Lebanon, in whatever form, they also need to have a pliant Lebanese government that basically legitimizes giving them the South Lebanon. In terms of all these different incursions and invasions into Lebanon, they come in different sizes and shapes. Let's put it this way. But for example, in 1982, when the Israelis invaded Lebanon, at the time, you had the Palestinian resistance, you had the PLO with other Lebanese factions and resistances that are operating there, but this was pre-Hezbollah. They invaded South Lebanon. They basically rolled over South Lebanon very quickly and ended up in the siege of Beirut during the summer of 1982, which kind of ended, in a sense, with American mediation and with the PLO having to leave Lebanon, and they end up in Tunis at the time. And the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacres of the Palestinian refugee camps is what happens after the PLO fighters left. Again, how can you trust Israelis in any kind of deal? They never comply with any deal, whether it's to their advantage or to not to their advantage. They always end up kind of interpreting the deals as they want and doing as they wish. So 1982 is interesting because in this idea, after 1982, they tried to impose an agreement, this, what comes to be an infamous treaty of May 1983, in which the Lebanese parliament ratifies a parliament that was, again, there was an Israeli occupation there. So the parliament basically ratified this agreement, which basically, in a sense, handed the South Lebanon, not de jure, but de facto hands South Lebanon to the Israelis. And the idea, again, was to create a Lebanese government that was going to be kind of pliant to Israel and to Israeli wishes. Remember, this is happening at a time when the Israelis were still occupying Lebanon. This agreement, because of what it is, basically ends up, because the civil war kind of continues, the deal itself is dropped, the parliament officially abrogates the deal, and then the kind of resistance really starts to push the Israelis out of large parts of Lebanon and pushes them back into South Lebanon, where the Israelis kind of remain in occupation south of the Litani from 1985 until the year 2000, when they, for the most part, they withdraw, and the UN certifies that they withdraw. I think what the Israelis are threatening to do now is to do this. They're saying, we're going to go into South Lebanon, we're going to go all the way to the Litani River, we're going to force the Lebanese government into a certain kind of agreement and treaty, and we're going to spend our time there basically destroying Hezbollah in a way that we destroyed the Palestinian fighters and the PLO, as they say it, as they claim it. Although, of course, the context is completely different. Right? The PLO could pick up and go to Tunis or to go somewhere else. But Hezbollah, of course, are Lebanese. So you start to hear this thing, and so the idea, and some of the local people here will agree with them. They'll say, yeah, but actually Hezbollah is Iranian. And if Hezbollah is Iranian, then why don't you pick up these people, especially those in certain leadership positions, pick them up and send them to Iraq, send them to Iran, send them to those areas, basically Shia areas, because in the end, they're not really Lebanese. And as for the rest, okay, we can see what happens and how to resettle them and what kind of buffer zone we can put and what kind of demilitarized zone we put, etc. So I see 1982 as a kind of an interesting thing that we need to keep in mind. Well, 82 and 83, really, with that. And then you have the war in 2006, where Hezbollah is where Israelis come in, again, with the stated declaration that they want to destroy Hezbollah. Hezbollah grows in stature during that 33-day war, until that war ends with this resolution, the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And effectively, Hezbollah kind of established a deterrence with the Israelis that lasted more or less until the 2023, until October 2023, when this new phase kind of begins. So there are similarities, but one last thing I would say there's a similarity to, which is interesting, which is the April 1996 agreement that happens, where in effect Hezbollah during the 1990s, and this is, I think, part of the lesson that Hezbollah learned from last year until now in the way in which they're fighting, which is, I would say, that between 2006, when they were able to establish, or 2006, when they're able to establish a deterrence, up until 2023, Hezbollah grew in terms of its bureaucracy, institutionally. It became a regional actor. They intervened in Syria militarily, very high-profile case. They had a lot of influence in Yemen, a lot of influence in Iraq. So, and through Hassan Nasrallah, its leader, he became a regional player and a regional actor rather than a kind of purely Lebanon-focused actor. That entailed a massive bureaucracy, a lot of growth. It became a quasi-army, and that was its downfall eventually when the Israelis were able to infiltrate this massive bureaucracy very deeply, and where they were able to hit a lot of the military forces and the command structures in 2023 and 2024. What I think they've done now in the meantime over these 15 months is to say, okay, we certainly cannot go back to that model. We have to go on a diet, go back down, go to the base of what we used to be, which was during this 1990s, and especially after this 1996 deal, this kind of grapes of wrath deal that happens where there's a ceasefire deal that legitimizes the rules of engagement that Hezbollah is allowed to do vis-a-vis the Israelis, meaning from a defensive resistance kind of rules of engagement that targets Israelis inside Lebanon, and it has legitimacy and the law to be able to push any kind of occupation forces out of Lebanon and defend Lebanese territorial integrity. I think this is where we are now. So this is why Hezbollah today basically says, okay, we're not here to invade the Israelis. We're not here to defeat Israel as such. We're here to ensure that Israel gets out of all Lebanese territory. We will defend all Lebanese villages from an Israeli invasion. And this is a role that they're much more suited to, and where tactically, militarily, they are much less likely to be infiltrated and much less likely to be defeated because it's more decentralized. The way the Lebanese terrain in South Lebanon, the physical terrain, suits these kinds of smaller operations. There's not this need to say, okay, we're holding this town. They're much more able to say, okay, we're going to come out, the Israelis come in, and then we do a surprise attack, then the Israelis withdraw. So there's a much more, I would say, tactical flexibility and decentralization in the way that they're being able to fight in South Lebanon today, which is more akin to the 1990s and less so as this kind of big regional actor with a kind of big army that was very easy for the Israelis to infiltrate, as we saw through that 2023 and 2024 war.
Yeah, certainly like returning to a bit of their roots and also lessons learned, right?
Yeah.
And,
definitely.
I think that kind of feeds into what I wanted to ask you next, which I think there's this, maybe because of the way that 2024 was a defeated battle in many ways. There's this almost like sense of inevitability about Israel occupying the South, but it's not actually an easy thing to do. I mean, you mentioned the distinction between, the PLO, you can just make them get up and leave, right? But Lebanese, on the other hand, these are their villages. They live there. I mean, that's where Hezbollah comes from, is the Lebanese people who live in the South, right? So I guess I just kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on that inevitability, because I don't think it's inevitable. And we talked about how this has been a longstanding ambition of the Israelis, but they've actually never been able. They did occupy for 18 years, but it was not an easy occupation, and they eventually had to retreat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what gets missed out in this equation, as you're saying, is the fact that for all these decades, so we're talking about, since 1919, they've been trying to get South Lebanon in one form or the other. But since 1919, they've not been able to do so. So there needs to be this kind of analysis of saying, yes, resistance to a large degree, and it's not just Hezbollah, it's pre-Hezbollah, and it'll be post-Hezbollah. There will be resistance as long as there's a foreign power that occupies land. There will be people that resist this. And as you're saying, between 1982, on to the year 2000, there was the Israeli occupation of all of South Lebanon. The resistance that eventually becomes Hezbollah, especially in the 1990s, there was a lot of different resistance groups, but effectively, it for the most part ends up being Hezbollah in the 1990s. Remember that in this period of the 1990s, Hezbollah was able to grow, to learn, while the Oslo peace process, while the kind of post-Cold War period was taking place. It was in the post-Civil War, kind of the ending of the Civil War period in Lebanon. There was, things of reconstruction. There was a whole different kind of politics taking place where Hezbollah was able to conduct its resistance and learn and grow in South Lebanon, without anybody really monitoring them. They was sort of on the side. So they had all those years in order to, perfect their ability to attack Israelis until the Israelis were unable anymore to really, the cost of holding the occupation was simply too high, and they ended up withdrawing in the year 2000 under fire. And I want to remind people that this is the first time that the Israelis withdrew from occupied Arab land under fire anywhere in the entire, over these 100 years. It's never happened before. So I think it's important to kind of to bear this in mind, that resistance, in however we want to define it, it's not, it has worked so far. Now, the question that Lebanese will have is to say, what is the cost of this resistance? That's the discussion we're happening today. So is the cost of resistance worth the destruction of the vast majority of Lebanon, the infrastructure? They might start hitting power plants, all this kind of thing. That's the question. That's the question that's being asked today.
And I mean, I understand that as a question. I do. Like, that's a fair question for people to have, is like, is the cost worth it? And I think that's also a very geographic question, right? Because it's like part of the country bears the brunt of Israel stealing their land, while the other part of the country is like, well, I just want to go about my daily life without having to deal with this. Is not my problem, which is an unfortunate, reality of the way that Lebanon is. I wanted to ask you about the Syria equation of all this, just your general thoughts on the fact that, it was, and we saw last week there was this report that came out about how the Americans were trying to pressure the Syrian government to get involved in Lebanon to basically fight Hezbollah alongside the Israelis. And then the Syrian government basically said no. And I can understand their reluctance to do that. They've got a lot of issues in their own country. And also I can imagine, I'm assuming the Turks were maybe like, no, absolutely not, because they have a bit of a veto when it comes to Syria's leadership. But just, curious your thoughts on that. I know a lot of people in Lebanon are fearful about the potential for a Syrian invasion into the east of the country. And also just to kind of throw this, since we're on Syria, I do think it's interesting. You sort of mentioned it earlier, but, for those who do think that resistance is futile, and I think it's an interesting debate to hear out, really. You look at a country like Syria, which has spent the last year plus since the new government took over, trying to basically signal they want normalization with Israel. They've never responded to a single act of Israeli military aggression, and they still get bombed. They still are having raids. The Israelis do raids inside Syria and kidnap people sometimes. The Israelis bombed just a couple weeks ago, if not last week. And the Israelis are still trying to basically make their theft of the Golan Heights permanent. But anyways, I threw a bunch of Syria stuff at you, so feel free to take on whatever you'd like there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Maybe a couple of things. The first, just let's say in terms of Lebanon, I am very worried. To be honest, I'm very worried. Yes, in fact, there's conflicting reports about what happened in terms of these rumors of the Syrian president being asked or requested to kind of come into Lebanon. I think obviously it hasn't happened, but I think a lot of people are legitimately worried that it might happen, depending on how the war here progresses. But it's intimately connected to the way in which the war progresses. If the Israelis become, for example, either more desperate, and Hezbollah gets defeated, in sort of in military terms, or hit very, very badly, then the question becomes, okay, well, who's going to mop in? Because ultimately, a lot of from what we know, a lot of the heavy weapons are in those areas along, in the Bekaa. They're not in South Lebanon as such, but they're north of the Litani River, and they're in parts in the Bekaa. And the question is, who's going to go in there and help to fight Hezbollah on that front? The Turks, I think the Turks don't want this. The Turks are worried, I think, from my understanding and from my reading, Turkey is worried that the Israelis and this Israeli will to want to dominate the region, if Lebanon falls and if Syria falls even more so, then it's right at the front. So the Israeli border effectively becomes with Turkey, and with the Israelis already already talking, and their rhetoric is all okay. The next, after Iran, the next big bad guy is Erdogan, and it's Turkey. I think they're quite. I think they're take that seriously. And so if Syria falls even more so in this sense, and if Lebanon falls, and Hezbollah, in particular Hezbollah falls, then then the Turks will have a problem on their thing. So I think the Turks have an interest for Hezbollah not to fall. That's how I see it now. I think it's true of many other countries, even those that we might find surprising. I think there's a lot of countries in the region that don't necessarily want Hezbollah to fall in the context of this larger Israeli kind of regional domination project, because they understand that Israel, as long as you have Israeli domination, you're going to have instability, you're going to have conflict, you're going to have war. So I think there are plenty that would want Hezbollah to stay, not because they like Hezbollah or anything like that, definitely not, but in this phase to make sure that the Israelis do not win decisively across the region. I think this is important. Now, the other part of what you're saying, remember, the Israelis came through, they did these two kind of curious operations from the east through the Bekaa. They came via Syria, right? After all, they landed via the Syrian border in Nabishit. When they came into the Lebanese area of Nabishit, they came in. There was two battles that took place, and then the Israelis had to pick up and withdraw. And remember, the Israelis came in with a bunch of people via Syria. There's no way I cannot imagine that somebody in Syria didn't know that the Israelis were coming in.
Right.
Right? They didn't participate. I mean, it's not that the Syrians participated, but they kind of came through Syria to do these operations. And at the same time, what was insidious is that the Israelis came in and they were wearing, at least some of them were wearing Lebanese army fatigues, which is very easy to get because the Americans are the ones who provide Lebanese army fatigues. So it's easy to get. It's not a big deal. So this kind of thing coming in, I think they said they were coming to get the remains of an Israeli pilot that had been around for decades. The remains of his body, but in fact, it's most likely they were coming in to test this border area to see what would happen from the Syrian side, to see what would happen on the Lebanese side, and to try to test Hezbollah's defenses along those borders. So what happened was you had Hezbollah and you had local villages, and fighting the Israelis when the Israelis did come, and there were some heavy casualties on the Lebanese side, and some I think on the Israeli side until the Israelis withdrew. So I think there are testing of the ground in which we try to see, okay, so what happens if they come in from Syria themselves directly, the Israelis? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, what if the Syrians are told to enter Lebanon in order to, quote unquote, mop up the situation depending on how the war in Lebanon goes? So the final point I would say here, and I think this connects to the much larger question you've been asking, which is in this kind of regional war, everything is going to, all this analysis and what happens, what won't happen, really, depends on what happens on the ground. If Hezbollah is crushed, you're going to have a very, very different kind of setup. If Iran is crushed and there's regime change and Iran gets kind of, changed completely, you're going to have a very, very different setup. You're going to have Israeli domination across the region. The Gulf has been severely weakened itself, and so will become even more dependent on the Israelis in that sense. The American configuration, I think America is going to withdraw anyway. Compared to what it was before, I think the American presence won't be the same. And so the question I think a lot of people are asking here is, is American interest or are American interests and Israeli interests the same? And can we play with this? If we think it's not the same, can we play? Is there a difference between the two? And if so, can we increasingly drive a wedge between these two different sets of interests in a way that kind of brings in the American interest, which is different than the Israeli interest? I think there are, and I know there are people in positions here and in kind of governmental positions and others that are trying to think along these lines. The Americans are interested in things including the gas and the oil, and kind of stabilizing. For this reason, they have the massive embassy here. This embassy, which is the most expensive embassy in the world, and the second largest embassy in the world after Iraq. It's massive. And if you see satellite pictures, if you see the way it's an absolutely massive kind of embassy that wasn't created because they want Lebanon to be in civil war and to have the embassy threatened, etc. That's not. I don't imagine that's what its role was. So I think there is an American interest, which is very different to what the Israeli interest is in Lebanon. And then the question in some of these policymakers, those that are not at the extreme right, they're trying to say, okay, can we separate these interests and can we try to negotiate with one to get us something a little bit different than the other? I don't know if that works or doesn't work, but I think that's part of the discussion that's in place. But in all cases, what happens will be totally directed by what happens on the ground militarily with the battles. And this is crucial to monitor.
I mean, you answered my last question already, basically, because I was going to ask you, like, what is a Iran loss versus an Iran win look like? Because, you do see the Iranians pretty explicitly tying their conditions for an end to the war that they are in right now with Israel having to withdraw from Lebanon and cease its bombing campaign there. Whether they can actually get that, we'll see. Yeah. But, what would be really like almost a little bit comical, if you can find anything comical in this horror nightmare that we're living in, would be if the Iranians do come out of this in a position of strength and do basically use their deterrence to as like a measure of protection for Lebanon from the Israelis. Will be all these people right now saying that the Iranians are actually the ones responsible for Lebanon's demise. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out for them. Anyways, Karim, I want to thank you for. Oh, go ahead, please.
I would say a last point, which is to say the way in which a deal, that I think what people are looking for the deal here is to say you had this deal in 2024 this is obviously no longer pertinent. The deal that needs to happen here is for the Israelis to agree that they have to give guarantees. I don't know what that means. Just as the Americans have to give guarantees in Iran, I don't know what that means. But this is the idea that there are guarantees that Israel absolutely no longer is able to come into Lebanon or threaten Lebanon in return for Hezbollah and whatever happens after that resistance kind of attacking the Israelis from this side. That's a deal that has to happen, but it cannot happen neither on the Iranian front nor on the Lebanese front unless the Israelis or the Americans take much more cost in order for them to be able to come to the deals. And I think it's more likely that that's going to happen on the Iran front first, and then on the Israeli front second. And yeah, they are absolutely connected, as you're saying. They're absolutely connected. And if they're separated, then Lebanon and Hezbollah, certainly, and Lebanon in general, I think will be in a lot of trouble.
Yes, indeed. Well, Karim, I want to thank you for joining me to break all of this down. And I just want you to remind our listeners where they can listen to your excellent podcast, which I watch all the time.
It's the Makdisi Street podcast, which I have my brothers, Osama and Sari. And we tend to do this each week. So, everybody's welcome to join in, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And hopefully we can get you back on again soon.
Thank you.